The ceiling fans above the Charleston County Courthouse moved in slow, deliberate circles, creating a faint draft that carried the scent of old paper and floor polish across the room. I sat at the petitioner's table with my hands folded together, the brace around my neck pressing against my skin every time I breathed in too deeply. The courtroom lights felt colder than they should have, as if the entire place had been designed to remind people that truth was never supposed to be comfortable. Across the aisle sat my parents and my brother. My mother clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white, her eyes fixed on the judge rather than me. My father's jaw was clenched, the muscles stiff the way it always got when he thought someone in the family was embarrassing him. Mason leaned back in his chair with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His half-smile drifted toward me as if this whole hearing were nothing more than a family misunderstanding that I had taken too far. When the bailiff called the court to order, the tension in the room shifted. Judge Halston adjusted his glasses, scanned the documents in front of him, and began reciting the case details without even looking up. Mason's attorney rose first, smoothing the sleeves of his tailored gray suit as he stepped forward. He spoke with the polished tone of someone who believed every word he said was the correct one. Your Honor, this case revolves around an unfortunate accident. My client's sister slipped in her kitchen. She was injured, and in her distress, she created an elaborate narrative that misrepresents my client as violent. Families disagree. People fall. This does not justify tarnishing a man's reputation. His eyes briefly swept across the room, landing on me with the same dismissive expression I had seen too many times whenever someone underestimated me. My parents nodded along as if rehearsed. Mason smirked, tilting his head slightly confident that the judge already believed him. I stayed silent. There was no point in defending myself with words when the truth sat quietly in the evidence folder at my elbow. Dana, my attorney, rose beside me. She did not raise her voice or posture. She simply stated with steady clarity, Your Honor, we request permission to begin with the medical findings, specifically the MRI taken at Roper Hospital the night of the incident. The judge nodded and signaled for the technician to power on the projector. The lights dimmed, replaced by the soft hum of machinery and the flicker of a blue glow as the screen illuminated behind the witness stand. Dr. Patel, the ER physician who treated me, stepped forward after being sworn in. He spoke with the measured confidence of a man who had spent his life diagnosing the silent truth of injuries patients were too scared to explain. What you are seeing, he said as the MRI filled the screen, is an axial view of the cervical spine. The region highlighted here shows soft tissue swelling and a lateral displacement between C4 and C5. The entire room seemed to lean closer. Dr. Patel continued, This injury pattern requires force applied from behind and above. It is not consistent with a self-generated fall. Mason scoffed under his breath, shaking his head as though he had caught the doctor exaggerating. But when Dr. Patel zoomed in on the darkened area around the vertebrae, the shift in Mason's expression happened so fast it was almost jarring. His smirk vanished, his mouth parted slightly, his eyes fixed on the screen wide and unblinking as if the image itself had reached out and gripped him. Dr. Dana said, Can you explain that section? Dr. Patel nodded. What you are seeing is acute edema. A swelling pattern like this requires abrupt compression, typically from someone being pushed with direct force. It cannot occur from simply slipping on the floor. The silence that followed was different from before, thicker, deeper, heavy enough to press against my ribs. Mason inhaled sharply. His shoulders rose, then dropped. His hand gripped the back of his chair until his fingers trembled. His chest tightened, breaths coming shorter and faster. Then, without warning, his body sagged. He dropped back into the chair, eyes rolling slightly, then slid sideways as his attorney lunged to catch him. My mother screamed his name. My father jumped to his feet, shouting for help. The bailiff called for paramedics while the judge struck his gavel against the bench, demanding order that no one could give him. Through the chaos, I kept my gaze on the glowing MRI. The truth had always been there in black and white. Now the world could finally see it. And as I sat still breathing slowly through the brace around my neck, I thought, to understand why my brother collapsed when he saw that MRI you need to know the night my parents chose him over me. I grew up in a narrow wooden house tucked behind a row of live oaks on the outskirts of Charleston, the kind of house that looked charming from the street but felt colder as you stepped inside a place where dust settled in the corners and silence settled in the spaces between people who never said what they meant. My earliest memories are split into two distinct worlds. One belonged to Mason, bright and noisy, and praised always full of attention. The other belonged to me, quiet and functional, as if the house itself had assigned us roles before we even learned to speak. My mother used to say that Mason was born smiling, the kind of child who made people want to gather around him, and she repeated that story so often it became a family anthem. I never heard any similar tale about myself. When I asked about my own birth, she simply said, "You were easy. You did not need anything." Even as a child, I understood that her idea of easy was not a compliment, but a reminder that I was expected to stay out of the way. Mason grew up wrapped in attention like a warm blanket. He got the new toys, the good shoes, the birthday parties with themed decorations, and store-bought cakes that towered with frosting. Meanwhile, I learned how to make my own fun from leftover craft paper, how to sew the loose straps of my sandals back on, how to be grateful when my birthdays were marked with a candle pushed into a slice of pie from the grocery store. When we were young, my father liked to take Mason to the hardware store just to walk around the aisles. He would point out tools and say, "One day, all this knowledge will be yours." He never said anything like that to me. Instead, I was left at home to help my mother fold laundry or dust bookshelves or watch the pot of water so it would not boil over. It was understood without ever being spoken that Mason was being prepared for a future while I was being prepared to support it. I remember one afternoon in July, the air thick enough to drink. Mason had been playing with matches behind the shed, even though my parents told him not to. I was sweeping the back porch when I heard him shout my name. I rounded the corner and saw flames licking up the dried leaves piled against the wood siding. I panicked and ran for the hose fingers shaking as I struggled to unkink the line. By the time I managed to spray water onto the shed, smoke had already begun to curl into the yard. When my parents came rushing outside coughing and frantic, Mason pointed straight at me. She was supposed to watch me. She let it happen. I opened my mouth to protest, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of the hose sputtering. My father turned to me with that look he saved for disappointment. "Why were you not paying attention to your brother?" "Do you understand how dangerous this was?" Mason sniffed, pretending to wipe away a tear, and my mother wrapped her arms around him as if he were the victim. I felt heat rising in my face, not from the fire, but from the humiliation of being blamed for something I had been trying desperately to fix. That moment etched itself into my memory like a scar. It was the first time I understood the rules of our family rules that did not appear in any handbook but governed everything. Mason's safety was my responsibility. Mason's mistakes were my fault, and Mason's future mattered more than my own. The favoritism did not stop when we got older. If anything, it sharpened. When Mason needed help with school projects, my parents hovered over him for hours, gluing pieces together and editing his essays until they sounded nothing like the boy who wrote them. When I asked for help, my mother would hand me a stack of books and say, "You are smart. You can figure it out." Mason got allowance money for doing chores he rarely completed. I vacuumed, washed dishes, and cleaned the bathrooms every weekend without being asked. Mason left messes across the house, and no one scolded him. I left a single bowl in the sink and heard a lecture about responsibility. Even the smallest moments revealed the divide. My father never missed one of Mason's little league games, cheering loudly from the stands with a thermos of coffee in one hand. But when I had my first choir recital, he realized halfway through the evening that he had forgotten to come. He showed up near the end, clapping weakly while looking at his watch. Afterward, he patted my shoulder and said, "Good job, kiddo, but you know I am better at sports than music." He said it with a smile, but the words stayed with me. It became the pattern of our lives. Mason commanded the spotlight while I learned to shrink myself small enough to fit the edges. And yet, like most children in my position, I still tried to earn their affection. I helped my mother make dinner even when I was tired from school. I cleaned the kitchen before my father got home because I knew it made his day easier. I covered for Mason when he broke things. I did these things without being asked, hoping one day they would look at me with the same warmth they reserved for him. But the warmth never came. Instead, it felt as though the more I carried, the less visible I became. I was the quiet daughter, the dependable one, the one who did not spark joy or worry. Mason was the center of our family's orbit. I was the gravity that held everything in place without anyone noticing. At the time, I told myself it did not matter. I told myself families were complicated and that every family had dynamics no one talked about. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just did not yet understand how far those patterns would reach or how much damage they would cause when I was finally the one who needed them to believe me. And I certainly did not know that the fire Mason started behind the shed would not be the last time I would be blamed for trying to put out something he caused. Adulthood did not arrive for me the way it did for most people. There was no moment of celebration, no feeling of stepping into a new chapter. Instead, it crept in quietly, slipping beneath the doors of our house like a cold draft. I slid into responsibility long before I understood what the word meant. By the time my friends were choosing dorm rooms and decorating their first apartments, I was learning how to balance hospital bills, insurance forms, and overdue notices addressed not to me but to my parents. When my father first lost his job at the shipyard, the atmosphere in our house shifted. My mother tried to hide the financial strain with extra coupons and smaller grocery lists, but the silence at dinner grew heavier each night. Mason reacted the same way he reacted to most inconveniences. He stayed away from home. He hung out with his friends, explored downtown Charleston, and returned only when he needed something. I worked part-time at the hospital cafeteria back then, a job I had taken to earn some extra money while finishing my classes, but suddenly, my paychecks were being used to keep our electricity from being shut off. My father said he would pay me back. He never did. After a few months, my mother started having health issues. The stress took a toll on her heart, and she needed regular appointments and medication she insisted we could afford, even though we could not. I drove her to every visit, filled every prescription, and sat in every waiting room. Mason did not show up for a single appointment. He always had an excuse. Work was busy, traffic was terrible. He forgot the time. When he did appear, he arrived with a loud hello as if the room should brighten just because he walked in, and my parents rewarded him with warm smiles and gratitude as if he had been by their side the entire time. I eventually found a steadier job at the hospital, one that paid better and offered health insurance. The moment I told my parents the news, my mother hugged me tightly. Not because she was proud, but because she realized it meant she no longer had to worry about finding coverage for her medications. I was grateful I could help, but part of me realized with a sinking heaviness that this was no longer temporary. I had become the default caretaker, the dependable one, the daughter who stepped in without question, my own dreams bent under the weight of their needs. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I walked through the front door to find a pile of unopened envelopes scattered across the table. My father sat at the head staring at a medical bill that was far higher than anything I had seen before. He rubbed his temples, sighing in the way that meant trouble. Without being asked, I picked up the stack of envelopes and started sorting through them. Past due. Final notice. Immediate attention required. My father looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Em, can you handle this for now? Just until we catch up." But there was no catching up. There was only slipping further behind. Mason breezed in later that night, laughing loudly as he told us about a weekend trip he and his friends were planning. A beach house rental, jet skis, a fancy dinner. He talked about it casually, as if it were normal to celebrate while your family drowned in debt. My parents listened to him with pride, asking about the itinerary, the photos he planned to take the friends he would see. When he left the room, my mother glanced at me and said, "Mason works hard. He deserves to have fun." That was the moment I understood exactly what I meant to them. I was not the child who deserved joy. I was the child who made sure joy stayed possible for everyone else. Later, after another hospital shift, I stopped at the bank to deposit my paycheck. The teller hesitated as she handed me the receipt, then asked if I needed help with the credit card payment linked to my name. I froze. I did not have a credit card. At least I thought I did not. When she printed the statement for me, my stomach dropped. There were charges for groceries, utilities, and even a few medical copays. The account had been opened months earlier. The address associated with it was my parents' house. When I confronted them that night, my mother looked ashamed but did not deny it. "We were going to tell you," she said, "but we needed something to fall back on. You are responsible. We knew we could trust you to handle it." She said it as if it were a compliment, as if having my identity used without my knowledge should make me feel honored. My father added, "It is only temporary. Mason will help once he gets settled." But Mason was never settling. He was always floating, always drifting toward whatever pleased him most. And my parents never expected him to be anything different. After that night, something in me shifted. I kept helping them. I kept paying. I kept driving to appointments, sorting paperwork, and covering emergencies. But I no longer pretended that their love was equal. I understood that in our family equation, Mason was the investment, and I was the insurance policy. Still, part of me believed that this phase would end. That one day, Mason would finally step up. That one day, my parents would see the difference between responsibility and exploitation. But that hope, small and fragile, would not survive what came next. And neither would the version of me who still believed my sacrifices mattered to them at all. The shift in my family did not happen with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, the way a tide rises without anyone noticing until their feet are already underwater. My parents' finances began to improve after years of struggle thanks to a piece of inherited land on the outskirts of Somerville that finally sold. I remember standing in the kitchen the day they received the confirmation call. My mother hung up the phone with a breathless laugh and threw her arms around my father. They spun for a moment, celebrating the way people do when they believe a suffering season has finally passed. I stood there smiling with them, believing for a brief, foolish moment that maybe things would change. Maybe they would finally see that I had been holding their world together. Maybe they would invest in me, just once. But that hope disappeared the moment Mason walked through the door. My father practically ran to him, clapping him on the back and telling him about the sale as if Mason had been the one negotiating with attorneys and surveyors and banks for the past 3 years. I had been the one who researched contractors, the one who took time off work to sign documents, the one who drove 2 hours each way for inspection meetings. None of that mattered the second Mason entered the room. My parents looked at him with joy, as if the money were meant for him all along. "We should talk about the future," my father said, pulling out the chair next to him. Mason dropped into it like a king settling onto a throne, and I watched from across the room as the 3 of them leaned over the kitchen table, whispering excitedly. No one invited me to sit. They spoke in low voices, the kind people use when they do not want certain ears to hear. Occasionally, my mother glanced in my direction, offering a tight, distracted smile, as if to assure me that everything was fine. But smiles like that are a kind of curtain. They hide what is happening on the other side. Later that week, I found a stack of papers on the dining room table. At first, I assumed they were more medical bills or insurance forms, but when I picked them up, my breath caught. They were draft documents for a family trust prepared by an attorney from Mount Pleasant. At the top was a list of assets, including the land sale, my parents' house, and a few remaining investments. Next to each item was a name. Every single one belonged to Mason. I flipped through the pages, searching for my name. There was nothing. Not an asterisk, not a footnote, not even a mistaken scribble. It was as if I did not exist. When my parents walked in and saw me holding the papers, they froze. My mother's face paled, and my father cleared his throat before motioning for me to sit. I did not. I stood there with the papers shaking in my hands, waiting for them to explain. My father sighed in the way he always did when he believed I was about to make things difficult. "Emily, this is not something you need to worry about. Mason is the one who will carry the family name. He needs stability." Those words stung more than any insult could have. As if I did not need stability. As if my years of sacrifice counted for nothing. I asked why I had not been included. My mother stepped forward and touched my arm delicately, as if offering comfort while delivering a blow. "Sweetheart, you will have a family of your own one day. Women build new homes. The assets should stay with the person who will stay connected to us." Her voice was soft, but the meaning was sharp enough to slice through bone. In that instant, I saw the truth laid bare. They had never considered me part of the future they imagined. I was the helper, the caretaker, the one who kept the present functioning. Mason, reckless as he was their legacy. But that was not the worst part. The worst part came when Mason appeared behind them, hands in his pockets, looking at me with a smirk that told me he had known about this all along. He stepped closer and said, "Do not make this dramatic. It is just easier this way." Easier. That word ricocheted inside me. My sacrifices had been labeled as convenience. My existence had been trimmed down to whatever made their lives run smoothly. My father placed a hand on my shoulder, then, squeezing gently, as though that gesture alone softened the cruelty. "You have always been independent. You will be fine." But I was not fine. I was being erased. I stood there forcing myself not to cry because tears would have given them the satisfaction of believing I was being emotional rather than wounded. After a few moments, I placed the papers back on the table and walked out of the room. As I climbed the stairs, I heard Mason laugh quietly, the same laugh he used when he won a game without deserving the victory. In my room, I closed the door gently, sat on the edge of the bed, and let the numbness settle over me. Everything I had done for them was invisible the moment it no longer served their vision of the future. I did not confront them again that night. I did not argue or beg for fairness. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar rising inside me. It was not anger, not exactly. It was clarity, sharp and cold and undeniable. For the first time, I understood that I would never be chosen, not unless I chose myself. I did not yet know how far their betrayal would go. I did not know what Mason would demand from me next, or how violently he would react when I finally told him no. But I knew this, the ground beneath our family had already cracked and nothing would ever return to the way it was. The confrontation that would eventually change everything did not begin with yelling. It began with a simple knock on my bedroom door, a soft tapping that felt oddly polite for the person standing behind it. I had just finished another late shift at the hospital and was sitting on the edge of my bed, still wearing my scrubs, letting the weight of the day slip from my shoulders. My neck ached from long hours and my mind felt foggy with exhaustion. When the knock came again, sharper this time, I knew it was not my mother. She would have called my name. My father would have barged in without knocking at all. That left only one person. I opened the door to find Mason leaning against the frame with the loose, casual posture of someone who believed every space he entered belonged to him. He had a file folder tucked beneath his arm and a look of thinly veiled annoyance, as if he had been inconvenienced by the need to speak to me directly. "We need to talk," he said, stepping into my room before I had a chance to answer. The air felt tight as he dropped the folder onto my dresser. Papers slid out and fanned across the wood. I recognized them immediately, the trust documents that had cut me out of the family's future. My jaw tightened. "There is nothing to talk about," I said, picking up one of the sheets just to have something in my hands. But Mason smiled the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Actually, there is. Mom and Dad want everything finalized. The lawyer needs your signature on one of the consent forms." I felt heat rising up my neck. What consent form? Mason tapped the page with one impatient finger. "This one. It basically says you acknowledge the transfer of assets and you do not plan to contest it. It is a formality." His tone made it sound like he was explaining instructions to a child. Anger flickered beneath my ribs, slow but steady. I handed the paper back to him. "I am not signing that." Mason let out an exasperated breath. "Emily, come on! Do not make this complicated. This is not yours. It never was." My hands curled into fists at my sides. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, but I kept my voice level. "I am not giving up my rights just to make things easier for you." For the first time, a crack formed in his smug expression. His eyes narrowed and he stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could smell the faint scent of cologne mixed with something sharper, the sour odor of anger. "You owe them," he said. The words were quiet but sharp. "They took care of you. They sacrificed for you. Now you repay them by stepping aside." My breath hitched. I replayed the years in my mind, the bills I paid, the hospital visits, the nights spent fixing crises he caused. Every sacrifice had been mine. Yet here he stood, rewriting history, casting himself as the victim of my refusal to be erased. I moved past him, reaching for the doorknob. "This conversation is over." but Mason grabbed my arm before I could turn it, fingers digging into my skin. The pressure made my breath catch. "You think you are better than us. That is what this is. You have always acted like you are above the family." His grip tightened and pain shot through my shoulder. "Let go," I said, trying to pull away. Instead of releasing me, Mason stepped closer, forcing me backward. My back hit the dresser, the edge digging into my spine. Panic flickered in my chest. I tried to push him off, but his other hand slammed down on the dresser beside me, caging me in. "Do not raise your voice," he hissed. "You know how Mom gets when you make things dramatic." The unfairness of that comment cut deeper than his grip. I had never been the dramatic one. I had been the quiet one, the compliant one, the one who swallowed every feeling to keep the peace. But that peace had never been real. It had been built on my silence, and now Mason was trying to force it back into place by brute force. I shoved him with both hands, catching him off guard, just enough to slip to the side. His eyes lit with something dark, a flash of rage I had never seen from him. Before I could react, he lunged forward and grabbed me by the shoulders. The world tilted as he shoved me with full force. My back hit the dresser again, and the lamp toppled to the floor with a shattering crash. My head whipped sideways from the momentum, sending a sharp pain shooting down my neck. I lost my balance and stumbled backward, arms flailing for something to grab. My heel caught on the edge of a rug, and I fell hard. My head struck the corner of the wooden frame with a dull, sickening thud. For a moment, everything went white. When sound returned, it came in fragments, the ringing in my ears, the uneven thud of my heartbeat, the muffled sound of Mason's breath. I tried to lift my head, but a hot, radiating pain shot down my neck and into my spine. My vision blurred. Mason stood over me, chest heaving. His voice trembled with shock, but it carried a thread of self-preservation. "Get up, Emily, get up. Do not make this something it is not." I tried to speak, but the pain in my throat made it difficult to breathe, let alone talk. When I attempted to sit up, a wave of dizziness washed over me, and I collapsed back to the floor. I heard footsteps rushing toward us, my mother's voice filled with alarm. "What happened?" Mason spoke before I could get a word out. "She tripped. She fell. I barely touched her." My father appeared next, eyes moving from the broken lamp to the bruise already forming on my temple. He frowned at me, not at Mason. "Emily, how did you manage to fall like that? We just had these floors cleaned." The disbelief in his voice was not directed toward Mason's lie, but toward me, as if I had become an inconvenience for injuring myself in front of witnesses. My mother knelt beside Mason, checking his hands as though he were the wounded one. "Are you hurt? You look shaken." Mason played the part perfectly, breathing hard, face pale. "She pushed me," he said quietly. I was trying to steady her. The words barely registered as the pain in my neck intensified, spreading like fire down my spine. I tried once more to speak, but my mother cut me off with a hushed, reprimanding tone. "Do not start blaming him, Emily. We all know how clumsy you can be." Something inside me cracked at those words. Not my bones this time. Something deeper. Something that had held me together through every slight, every dismissal, every quiet injustice. I realized in that moment that the people hovering over me would never see the truth unless someone else forced them to. And for the first time in my life, I understood I could no longer be the quiet daughter. The injury Mason caused would not fade, and neither would the truth. The ride to the hospital was a blur of ceiling lights and muffled voices, each sound stretching and collapsing like an echo trapped underwater. My father drove, gripping the steering wheel so tightly the veins in his hands bulged. My mother sat beside me in the back seat, not touching me, not asking if I was in pain, simply repeating the same phrase as if it were a shield against any responsibility. "You need to be more careful. I told you those rugs were dangerous." The world outside the window smeared into streaks of color. I kept my gaze forward, too afraid that turning my head would send another wave of pain down my spine. Every small bump in the road made my stomach lurch and my vision flicker. When we finally reached the emergency entrance of Roper Hospital, my father barely slowed the car before telling me to get out. He did not offer an arm. He did not help me stand. He simply said, "We cannot be here all night. Make sure you tell them exactly what happened." That last sentence carried weight. Not the kind of weight that comes from concern, but the kind that comes from fear. Fear of what I might say. I slid out of the car and staggered forward, using the wall for balance. My mother walked a few steps behind me, scrolling through her phone, as though this were an errand she had been forced to run at an inconvenient time. Once inside, the emergency department was buzzing with the usual chaos. Nurses in Navy scrubs hurried past with clipboards, and the overhead speaker announced a code blue in another wing. The fluorescent lights stabbed at my eyes, making everything too bright, too sharp. I checked in at the front desk, and the triage nurse immediately noticed the brace position I was holding and the way my hands shook. She guided me to a wheelchair, ignoring my mother's insistence that I was exaggerating. Within minutes, they escorted me to an evaluation room. A nurse asked what happened, and before I could respond, my mother answered for me. She tripped over the rug. "She has always been clumsy." The nurse turned to me. "Is that what happened?" Her voice was calm, but her eyes were searching, waiting for the story behind the story. I opened my mouth, but the pain in my neck pulsed so hard it stole the air from my lungs. All I could manage was a whisper. "I fell." The nurse hesitated, then nodded slowly. She added a note to the chart and left the room. When Dr. Patel entered, the air shifted. He introduced himself, checked my reflexes, and gently pressed along the sides of my neck. Even that light contact sent a jolt of pain down my spine. At one point he paused, studying the way I winced, and asked again how I fell. This time my mother stayed quiet. I stared at the floor tiles and repeated what I had said before. I fell. Dr. Patel did not look convinced. He ordered an immediate MRI of my cervical spine. When the transport team arrived, they wheeled me through a series of long hallways that smelled faintly of antiseptic and the sterile scent of cold air. The closer we got to the imaging department, the quieter the hospital became, until all I could hear was the hum of machinery behind thick doors. The MRI technician helped me onto the sliding table. I gripped the edges tightly as the cushion molded beneath my weight. The technician placed blocks on either side of my head to keep me from moving. Every muscle in my body tensed as the table slid into the cylindrical chamber. The walls closed around me with a faint echo, and for a moment I felt trapped, caught between pain and memory, unable to move or breathe without sharp reminders of what had happened. The machine started its rhythmic pounding, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through my skull. Each pulse seemed to sync with the throbbing in my spine. I stared at the ceiling of the chamber, the lights dim, the air cool. I felt my chest tighten as images of Mason's face flashed behind my eyes, the moment of anger when he pushed me, the shock on his face afterward, the lies he fed our parents without hesitation. I closed my eyes against the dizziness, willing myself to stay still. When the MRI ended, the technician slid me out and gently removed the head blocks. A nurse wheeled me back to an exam room where I waited under the dim lights, my thoughts swirling like storm clouds. My parents were not there. They had left a text message. "Let us know when you are done. Do not make a big deal out of this." Dr. Patel returned with the results displayed on a tablet. He pulled up the scan and pointed to the area in question. "This is where the injury is," he said, tracing the outline of the vertebrae. "There is swelling and a slight displacement between C4 and C5. The words sounded distant, like he was speaking through water. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "It means you sustained a direct impact," he replied. "Something struck or pushed you with force. This type of injury does not come from a gentle fall, not even a clumsy one." My throat tightened. I felt the air leave my lungs all at once. Dr. Patel studied my face carefully and lowered his voice. "Are you sure you were not pushed?" The question lingered between us like a thin, fragile thread. I swallowed hard. My parents' voices echoed in my head. "Do not start blaming him. We all know how clumsy you can be." I closed my eyes. I opened them again. I said nothing. Dr. Patel exhaled slowly and typed something into the chart. I caught a glimpse of the words just before he turned the screen away, inconsistent with stated mechanism. He printed a copy of the MRI and handed it to me. "This is important documentation. Make sure you keep it somewhere safe. If your symptoms worsen or if you remember anything else about what happened, you need to tell someone." His eyes held mine for a moment longer, silently communicating something more than instructions. He knew. He could not say it, but he knew. I clutched the MRI film against my chest as I left the exam room, the cool plastic trembling between my fingers. When I stepped outside into the humid Charleston night, my parents' car was nowhere in sight. They had not even waited. A single text from my mother lit up my phone. "We assumed you were fine. Mason is upset. Do not drag this out." I stared at the message until my vision blurred, not from pain this time, but from the realization that the fracture in my family had gone deeper than the injury in my neck. For the first time in my life, the truth was not just inconvenient. It was undeniable, and someone other than me had seen it. I sat alone in the small rented room above the old bakery on Meeting Street, the one place I could afford after leaving my parents' house that night. The room was barely larger than the hospital on-call spaces I sometimes napped in during long shifts. The walls were thin, the window overlooked an alleyway, and the hum of the refrigerator in the corner was louder than it should have been. Still, it was the first space in my life that felt like mine. I laid the MRI film on the narrow table in front of me and stared at it the way someone might stare at a confession written in permanent ink. The black and white image felt almost alive under the lamplight, the swollen area around the vertebrae forming a shape I could not unsee. It was the truth captured in cross-section, a truth my family had spent years avoiding denying and rewriting. My hands trembled as I traced the outline on the film through the protective sleeve. Each ridge, each shadow, each blurred white line told a story my parents refused to hear. In the quiet of that room, without their voices drowning mine, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge the words I had swallowed for years. It was not an accident. It was not clumsiness. It was not my fault. The pain in my neck pulsed, sending small shocks down my spine whenever I moved, but the ache inside me was worse. It was the ache of clarity, the kind that arrives slowly settling into the bones after years of denial. I leaned back against the wall, closed my eyes, and replayed the look on Mason's face when he shoved me. It was not fear. It was entitlement. He had expected me to give up the same way I had always given up for him. When I did not, he reacted the only way he knew how, with violence disguised as frustration. I thought of my parents' faces at the hospital, the way my father had looked irritated rather than concerned, the way my mother had checked Mason's hands instead of my pulse. I remembered their text messages demanding compliance, demanding silence. The weight of their expectations pressed against my chest like a familiar but suffocating blanket. For 28 years I had carried their disappointments, their excuses, their emotional accounting. For the first time, I felt the full shape of what that burden had cost me. My phone buzzed on the table, jerking me back into the present. The screen lit up with a new message from my mother. "Mason is very upset about everything. Please do not escalate this. We are all tired." I stared at the words, feeling them settle into the pit of my stomach. Not one question about my injury. Not one acknowledgement of the pain in my neck. Not one ounce of concern. Only a plea to protect the comfort of the person who hurt me. A second message followed a moment later. "Do not contact anyone or make this a bigger issue than it needs to be. Come home tomorrow and talk calmly. Mason is worried about you." Worried? The word almost made me laugh. I set the phone face down. My chest tightened, but not from panic. From recognition. A quiet understanding began to form a soft but unwavering truth. They would never choose me. Not over Mason, not over their own pride, not even over my safety. The realization did not bring anger. It brought stillness, the kind that comes when something inside you finally clicks into place. I had always believed that if I worked harder, sacrificed more, or stayed silent long enough, they would see me. They would appreciate me. They would choose me. But they never would. The room felt even smaller as the truth settled deeper. I lifted the MRI film again and held it toward the light. The damaged vertebrae glowed faintly, a physical imprint of everything I had endured. This was not just an injury. It was the turning point. A knock echoed from somewhere in the hallway, followed by muffled footsteps, but I barely heard it. My mind drifted to the years of blame I had carried. The shed fire that Mason started, the the broken vase I was accused of knocking over, even though he had been the one running through the hallway, the times he shoved me during arguments, and I apologized because I did not want to cause trouble. Every injustice suddenly aligned like pieces of a puzzle I had been too close to see. The pattern was unmistakable. I had been conditioned to believe I was responsible for everyone's mistakes, that my worth was measured by how much I could endure without complaint. That staying quiet was the only way to keep the peace. But peace built on silence is not peace. It is submission, and I was done submitting. Another buzz from my phone vibrated across the table. This time, it was a message from Mason. "Please do not make this worse. Come home and talk like an adult." I clenched my jaw as I read it. He sounded rehearsed, as if trying to say the right words while hiding the wrong intentions. The same pattern, the same manipulation. I placed the MRI back into its sleeve and slid it into a folder. My hands stopped shaking. My breath steadied. The truth was no longer a threat. It was an anchor. And for the first time in my life, I felt the beginnings of something I had never allowed myself to feel. Resolve. I was injured. I was alone. But I was no longer blind. I knew then with absolute clarity that staying quiet would only allow history to repeat itself, and history was done repeating. The silent realization I had that night would become the first step toward everything that followed, and I had no idea yet just how far the truth would take me. I did not decide to find a lawyer out of anger. I decided out of exhaustion, the kind that settles in your bones after years of carrying weight that was never meant to be yours. 2 days after the MRI, I returned to work with a stiff neck brace and a fog of pain that medication could not fully dull. My coworkers tried to hide their concern, but their eyes lingered on the bruising along my jawline and the way I moved too slowly, too carefully. I brushed their questions away with vague answers, the kind you give when the truth feels too heavy to speak aloud. After my shift, I found myself standing in the hospital parking lot, clutching my bag and the MRI folder to my chest. The Charleston air was thick with humidity clinging to my skin like a second layer. I stared at my car, unsure whether to go home to the silence of the rented room or to do something I had never done before. Ask for help. The thought unsettled me. I had spent my life being the one who solved problems, not the one who brought them to someone else's door. But every time I swallowed the urge to seek support, I heard Mason's voice in my head, dismissive and entitled. "You owe us. You always make things dramatic." Those words made me clench my jaw until the pain shot up into my temples. I pressed the MRI folder tighter against my side. Finally, I opened the folder, staring once more at the scan that had changed everything. The injury was undeniable. The truth was undeniable. I could no longer pretend. I pulled out the business card Dr. Patel had slipped under the MRI without a word. When I first noticed it, I thought it was a mistake. But when I flipped it over, his handwriting on the back told me otherwise. "If you need guidance, call her. She will believe you." I traced the embossed letters on the front. Dana Whitford Family Law and Victim Advocacy. I hesitated, the weight of years pressing down on me, urging me to stay silent. My parents' voices echoed in my mind. "Do not escalate this. You always misunderstand things. Mason is upset." But for the first time, their voices did not drown out my own. I unlocked my phone and dialed the number. The office assistant answered with a calm professionalism that made my throat tighten. When she asked what I needed help with, the words caught in my chest. I had to force them out. "I think I need to talk to someone about being hurt." There was a soft pause on the other end, then a shift in tone. She asked me what day I could come in. My voice shook when I answered. "Today." An hour later, I sat in a quiet office with soft lighting walls lined with shelves of legal books and a single framed print that read, "You deserve to be safe." The door opened and a woman stepped inside. Her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and she wore a navy blazer with sleeves rolled neatly at the cuffs. She looked at me for a long, measured moment, not with pity, but with recognition. "Emily." "I am Dana. It is good to meet you." I swallowed hard. I was not used to being greeted as someone who mattered. "Say whatever you feel comfortable sharing," she said. There is no rush. Silence stretched between us. My fingers dug into the edge of the MRI folder. For a moment, I could not speak at all. When the words finally came, they were jagged and thin. My brother shoved me. I fell. I got hurt. Dana nodded, not surprised, not judging. She waited. They said it was an accident, I added. My voice cracked. They always say it is my fault. She motioned gently toward the folder. May I see the scan? I handed it over. Dana laid the MRI film on the table and studied it with an expression that sharpened with each passing second. Her brow furrowed. She pointed at the swollen area on the cervical spine. This is not from a simple fall. Dr. Patel said the same thing I whispered. He wrote it in the chart. And your parents knew you were this injured. I nodded. They seemed more worried about Mason. The way Dana exhaled told me she had seen this pattern before. Too many times. She sat back and folded her hands. Emily, you are not overreacting. You are not imagining things. You are not dramatic. What happened to you is serious. Her words hit me like a physical force. I had spent so long being dismissed that validation felt foreign, almost painful. Dana continued, her voice steady. You need legal protection, and documentation is key. You already have part of what we need. She tapped the MRI. Medical evidence is powerful. If you choose to take action, this can help. I blinked several times, overwhelmed. What would taking action even look like? My entire life had been built around avoiding confrontation. If you want it, Dana said, I will walk with you through every step. You do not have to face this alone. Something inside me cracked at those words. Not with pain, with relief. No one had ever offered to stand with me before. I sat there staring at the MRI, feeling the weight of my family's silence and the possibility of something different rising inside me. For the first time, someone saw the truth without me having to beg them to. Dana leaned forward. Emily, you were hurt, and someone is responsible for that. You deserve to be heard. My hands trembled as I nodded. I want to move forward. I want to do this. Dana reached for a pen and a legal pad, her movements precise and assured. Then, let us begin. I sat a little straighter, the brace on my neck tugging as I lifted my chin. The room felt warmer now, less suffocating. The truth had finally found a place to breathe. And so had I. The next morning, I returned to Dana's office with a folder full of every document I had collected over the years, without fully understanding why I kept them. Old bills, text messages, saved voicemails, screenshots, receipts. Pieces of a puzzle I had never expected to assemble. Dana greeted me with a warm nod and motioned for me to sit. She wore the same calm expression she had the day before, but now her posture carried purpose, like she was stepping into a battle she already knew how to win. Before we begin, she said, I want you to understand something. This is not about revenge. This is about truth. Truth, I repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of the word. She spread a legal pad in front of her and clicked her pen. I need you to walk me through everything from the beginning, not just the night of the injury. Everything. It felt overwhelming at first, like standing at the base of a mountain made of memories I had forced myself to forget. But Dana guided me gently, one question at a time, filling the page with notes. After nearly an hour, she closed her notebook and looked at me with unwavering steadiness. The pattern is clear. You have been dismissed and silenced for years. This did not start with the shove. The shove is simply where the truth became visible. She stood and walked to the whiteboard mounted on the wall. With a blue marker, she wrote 3 words: Medical Evidence Motive Pattern. These are the pillars of your case. Medical evidence we already have. Motive we can establish through the trust documents and Mason's demand that you sign away your rights. And the pattern is everything you have told me. I watched her work, feeling something in my chest loosen. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Someone finally understood how the pieces fit. We will strengthen each pillar, Dana said, and that begins with collecting every shred of evidence we can find. She handed me a list of tasks. It was long, methodical, and intimidating. Retrieve your hospital records from the night of the injury. Forward every text message related to your parents and Mason. Screenshot your mother's messages telling you not to escalate things. Save voicemail logs. Save call duration history. Photograph any visible bruising. Document your symptoms daily. I stared at the list. It felt like she was asking me to uncover parts of myself I had buried. Dana sat back down, her voice softening. Emily, everything you lived through counts. Everything they told you to ignore matters now. I nodded slowly, letting the truth settle. When I left her office with the list in hand, I felt the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. But for once, it was not the crushing kind. It was the weight of reclaiming something that had always belonged to me. I spent the rest of the day gathering everything on Dana's list. I combed through old email chains between my parents and me emails where I had begged for information about bills I was expected to pay. There were messages filled with guilt-laden lines like, "We thought you would handle this for us since you are so responsible." I forwarded them all to Dana. I found texts from Mason casual but cruel. "You always make things harder than they need to be. You are so dramatic. You owe them after all they have done." Each message felt like a shard of glass lodged under my skin, but I saved them anyway. I returned to the rented room and pulled out the hospital paperwork from the night of the injury. Buried near the bottom was the note Dr. Patel had written, inconsistent with stated mechanism. I snapped a photo of it, then scanned every page. When I reached the part of the list about documenting bruises, I hesitated. I walked to the bathroom mirror and slowly lifted the collar of my shirt. The bruise along my shoulder had deepened into a dark bloom, spreading like ink under my skin. The one on my temple had yellowed at the edges. Seeing them made my throat tighten. These bruises were not just signs of injury, they were proof. Proof of something I had tried so hard not to see. I photographed them from every angle, feeling the weight of each click. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the Charleston rooftops, I turned to the final task on Dana's list. Check for external witnesses or cameras near the house. My stomach twisted at the thought of returning there. I did not want to face my parents. I did not want to risk seeing Mason. But I knew I had to try. The neighborhood felt different as I drove through quieter, heavier. I parked a block away from the house and walked the rest of the distance, keeping my hood up. I did not go near the front door. Instead, I stopped at the edge of the neighbor's property. Mrs. Giles, an older woman who often watered her hydrangeas late into the evening, noticed me and stepped closer. "Emily, I have not seen you around. Everything all right?" I forced a small smile. "I am okay. I just wanted to ask if your security camera happened to catch anything a few nights ago." Her eyes widened slightly. "That night you got hurt." My breath caught. She knew. People always know more than you think. Without waiting for me to answer, she motioned for me to follow her inside. Her living room was small but warm, lined with framed photos of grandchildren and scented with lavender. She pulled up the camera footage on her screen. My heart pounded as she clicked through the timeline. Then we heard it. Mason's voice, muffled but sharp with anger. "You are going to sign it whether you like it or not." It punched through the speakers with such force that my knees nearly buckled. Then another sound, the thud of my body hitting the dresser, the breath leaving my chest. Mrs. Giles covered her mouth, horrified. "Oh, dear Lord. Emily." I blinked back tears, forcing myself to stay steady. "Can you send this to me?" She nodded firmly. "I absolutely can, and I will testify if needed." I left her house with the footage on a small USB drive in my pocket, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. That night, as I placed the USB next to the MRI and the trust papers, a realization washed over me. I had evidence, real evidence. And it did not just prove what happened, it proved who Mason really was, and who my parents had chosen to protect. The backlash from my family began sooner than I expected. It started with a single phone call from my mother the morning after I received the camera footage. I had barely slept, spending half the night replaying the recording again and again, each listen tightening something inside my chest. When the phone rang, I hesitated before answering. Her voice came through sharp-clipped, already on the offensive. "Emily, we need to talk." I could hear the tension in the background, the muffled sound of my father's voice feeding her lines like a stage whisper. I said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "Mason told us you are telling people he pushed you." Her tone carried disbelief, as if the idea itself was ridiculous. I swallowed hard. He did push me. The silence on the other end was immediate and chilling. Then she sighed long and disappointed. That is not what happened. You tripped. He was trying to steady you. We are not going to let you twist this. Before I could respond, my father took the phone. His voice was heavy with practiced authority. Emily, you are creating unnecessary drama. This could ruin your brother. You need to stop before things get worse. The quiet threat in his tone made my stomach tighten. Worse for who I asked. For all of us, he snapped. Families handle problems privately. You do not drag them into the public. You do not involve outsiders. Outsiders. He meant Dana. He meant the hospital. He meant anyone who was not under the same roof of denial they lived beneath. I ended the call without saying another word, but they were not finished. That afternoon, as I prepared to leave for my shift, someone started pounding on the bakery's side door. Not knocking, pounding. My heart raced as I approached the window and peeked through the blinds. My parents stood outside my mother looking frantic, my father red-faced pacing. I opened the door only enough to stand in the frame, keeping my body angled to block entry. My mother rushed forward as if to embrace me, but I stepped back. She froze, her expression twisting into confusion. Emily, we need to fix this, she said, her voice trembling with urgency. Mason is devastated. He is barely holding himself together. The anger flared in me before I could stop it. He is devastated. Her eyes narrowed as if she could not understand why that upset me. Your brother is scared, she insisted. If this becomes a legal issue, it could ruin his future. My father stepped forward, his voice low and commanding. You need to call that lawyer and tell her you made a mistake. This is a misunderstanding. Fix it. Fix us. Fix the family. There it was again. Not concern for my injury. Not a single question about my pain or my recovery. Only demands. Only instructions. Only fear of consequences. I crossed my arms over my chest to steady myself. I cannot undo what happened. My father's expression hardened. You can and you will. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. When he handed it to me, I recognized the title immediately. Statement of Clarification. It was a written declaration saying the injury was an accident caused by my own loss of balance, that Mason had never laid a hand on me, that any implication otherwise was due to emotional stress. My mother wrung her hands as I read it. It is just a formality, she said. If you sign this, everything goes back to normal. Normal! The word felt like poison. Before I could respond, something behind them caught my eye. Mason stood at the end of the alley, hands shoved in his pockets, watching us with that same expression he always wore when he expected me to fold. It was not guilt, it was expectation. He took a step forward. Emily, let's not drag this out. This is ridiculous. You know you tripped. The arrogance in his voice snapped something inside me. I crumpled the document in my hand. I am not signing this. My father's face darkened. You are being selfish. Your mother is exhausted. Your brother is terrified. Stop thinking only about yourself. Something inside me finally steadied. I stood straighter despite the pain in my neck. For the first time, I looked directly into his eyes and said, I have never thought only about myself. That is the problem. The silence that followed was thick and electric. My mother's expression flickered between anger and disbelief. My father stepped closer, lowering his voice. Do not test us. You are making a very big mistake. I held my ground. I already made the biggest mistake. I trusted you. Their faces shifted, something raw and indignant rising to the surface. My father opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand, stopping him. I am not coming home. I am not fixing this. I am not protecting Mason anymore. My mother shook her head in anger. You will regret this, Emily. You are turning your back on your family. I felt a strange calm settle over me. No, you turned your back on me first. I closed the door before they could respond. Their voices rose on the other side, muffled by the wood, but I did not listen. For the first time in my life, I let their words fall away from me like water off stone. That evening, I forwarded the recording from Mrs. Giles to Dana. She called me within minutes. "Emily, do not be afraid. This changes everything." I sat on the edge of my bed, the USB drive still warm from my pocket, and finally let myself breathe. My family had declared war to protect Mason, but now I had something stronger than their manipulation. I had evidence, and soon they would learn what truth looks like when it is no longer buried under silence. 2 days passed without a word from my parents or Mason. The silence felt unnatural, too deliberate, like the long inhale before a storm. I tried to focus on work at the hospital, but every small movement sent a sting of pain down my neck and reminded me of everything I was trying to outrun. When my shift ended that evening, I found myself walking back to the bakery room with my shoulders tense and my thoughts spiraling. I kept expecting another confrontation, another demand, another threat disguised as family concern. Instead, when I reached the top of the stairs leading to my room, I found a small gift bag sitting next to my door. The bag was pale blue with a white ribbon tied neatly at the handles. For a moment, I thought it might have been left by the bakery owners downstairs. But when I picked it up, a familiar floral perfume drifted from the tissue paper. My stomach tightened. My mother's scent. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a small jar of lavender cream, the expensive kind she only bought when things were going well. A folded note sat on top. I knew her handwriting immediately. "Come home. We can work this out. Families forgive." My hands trembled. The gesture was gentle, soft, almost warm. But beneath it, the same message echoed. Silence. Compliance. Let everything go for the sake of keeping peace that had never actually existed. I placed the jar on the small table beside my bed and stared at it for several minutes, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Later that night, as the streetlights flickered through my window, my phone buzzed with a new message from my mother. "She wants to talk. She wants to apologize. Mason feels awful. Come by tomorrow. Let's sit as a family." For a brief moment, something inside me cracked open. A part of me I hated still longed for them to see me, to choose me, to apologize, to mean it. I texted Dana. "They want to talk. Should I go?" Her reply was immediate. "Only if you feel safe, and only if you keep your guard up. People who have been lying for years do not change overnight." I stared at her words for a long time. Still, grief lingered in me, the kind that whispers, "What if?" The next day, against my better judgment, I drove to the house. When I arrived, the windows glowed warmly, the same golden light I had grown up under. My mother opened the door before I even knocked. She looked softer than she had in weeks, her eyes slightly red as if she had been crying. "Emily," she whispered, pulling me into a hug I did not return. "Come in, sweetheart. We need to fix this." My father stood in the living room, hands clasped, face stiff but attempting something close to remorse. Mason sat on the sofa, his posture slouched, his expression carefully arranged to appear wounded and contrite. "Emily," he murmured, "I am sorry. I should not have raised my voice." I blinked. Raised my voice. That was the lie they had rehearsed. My mother squeezed my arm gently. "We all made mistakes. Let's move forward. Let's put this behind us." The words were polished smooth, expertly placed, and yet something about the moment felt off, too coordinated, too timed, too perfect. My mother motioned for me to sit, and for a brief second I felt myself wavering. Maybe they were trying. Maybe they wanted to do better. Maybe. The hope was fragile, nearly invisible, but still alive. I followed her toward the sofa. As I passed the hallway entrance, I heard a sound. A laugh. A quiet, sharp one. I froze. My parents' voices echoed faintly from the living room as they continued their rehearsed apologies, but down the hallway the sound came again. A stifled chuckle. I stepped closer. The voices grew clearer. My father's low whisper. "She will fold. She always does." My mother's thin laugh. "Of course she will. She has no one else." Then Mason's voice, smug and certain. "Once she drops the case, everything goes back to normal." My stomach lurched. Heat rushed to my face. Every apology, every tear, every soft word had been part of a script written solely to manipulate me. I backed away slowly, the words echoing in my mind like a physical blow. "She has no one else." That was when I realized something important. I had someone. I had Dana. I had the truth. And I had myself. I walked back into the living room, my expression unreadable. My mother smiled hopeful. My father straightened. Mason looked at me like he had already won. I nodded once, letting them believe whatever they wanted. Then I reached for my bag. "I think we are done here." Their smiles fell instantly. My father's voice rose. "Emily, stop this foolishness." My mother's eyes narrowed. "Do not ruin this family." Mason stood abruptly. "You cannot do this." I opened the door without looking back. I already did, and I left them standing in the warm glow of a house that had never felt like home. The night before the hearing arrived with an eerie stillness, the kind that settles into your skin and makes every sound feel louder than it should be. I sat alone in my small room above the bakery, the hum of the refrigerator blending with the occasional car passing on Meeting Street. The air tasted heavy, thick, with humidity and anticipation. My neck brace pressed against my jaw as I leaned over the table, staring at the stack of documents neatly arranged in front of me. The MRI film, the hospital report, the messages from my parents, the camera footage. Each piece felt like a brick in the wall I was finally building to protect myself. Yet even surrounded by evidence, a part of me trembled. Not because I doubted the truth, but because I had spent my entire life being taught to second-guess my own voice. I traced the edge of the medical report with my fingertips, feeling the weight of every word Dr. Patel had written, inconsistent with stated mechanism. Those 4 words had become both a lifeline and a wound. They validated my pain and exposed the lie I had been forced to repeat. My phone lay face up beside the papers. No messages from my parents, but that absence was a message in itself. They were waiting for tomorrow, waiting to take the stand with the same confidence they had always wielded when rewriting history in their favor. I imagined them rehearsing their statements, smoothing out their story, adjusting their expressions until they looked convincingly heartbroken. They were good at that. They had spent years practicing. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my breathing. This would be the first time in my life that I stood before them and did not flinch. The thought was both empowering and terrifying. Around 9:30, a knock sounded at the door. My heart jumped, but the voice that followed eased my nerves. "Emily, it is Dana." I opened the door to find her standing there with a stack of folders in one hand and 2 cups of decaf coffee in the other. She stepped inside with the calm presence of someone who had weathered storms much darker than mine. "I did not expect you tonight," I said. Dana placed the coffee on the table and set her folders beside mine. "I know," she answered, settling into the chair across from me, "but I wanted to go over a few things before tomorrow, and I wanted to check on you." Her concern hit harder than I expected. I swallowed the knot in my throat. I unfolded the MRI film and handed it to her. She held it up to the light, studying it with the same focused intensity she always brought to her work. "This," she said, tapping the swollen area with her nail, "is undeniable, and tomorrow it will speak louder than any lies they try to tell." I nodded, though a part of me still feared the courtroom, feared their voices, feared the weight of their disappointment. Dana must have sensed it. She leaned forward, her expression softening. "Emily, fear does not mean you are weak. It means you are human. What matters is that you are walking into that room anyway." I looked down at my hands, noticing the faint tremble in my fingers. What if they twist everything? "They will try," Dana said, "but they cannot twist evidence. They cannot twist a medical record. They cannot twist a voice that finally refuses to be silenced." Her words steadied something inside me. We spent the next hour reviewing the order of testimony. Dr. Patel would speak first, then the neighbor Mrs. Giles, then me, and finally the footage. When Dana slid the USB drive across the table, I felt a flicker of hope. It was small, but it was real. Eventually, she closed her folders and stood. "Try to sleep," she said, resting a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You have truth on your side, and truth has a way of standing tall even when everything else shakes." After she left the room, felt strangely quiet again, but the fear that had hovered over me earlier had softened. I changed into comfortable clothes and crawled into bed. The mattress sagged in the middle, and the sounds of the bakery's ovens cooling below seeped through the floorboards, but for once the imperfections felt grounding. I stared at the ceiling, letting the darkness wrap around me like a blanket. Tomorrow, I whispered into the quiet. Tomorrow, I would face them. Tomorrow, the truth would no longer belong only to me. My neck throbbed with a deep, steady ache, but I placed a hand over the brace and let the pain remind me of why I was doing this. Not for revenge, not for validation, but because my body had spoken the truth before my voice ever dared to. My eyes finally grew heavy, and as sleep pulled me under, one final thought lingered. Tomorrow, the silence ends. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of cold that slips through layers of clothing and settles straight into your bones. Charleston was overcast, the sky a muted gray that matched the heaviness in my chest. I arrived at the courthouse early, the building looming above me with its towering white columns and weathered stone steps. For a moment, I stood still at the bottom, staring up at the entrance, as if it were a threshold to another life entirely. In a way, it was. Inside, everything felt too bright. The polished floors reflected the fluorescent lights overhead, and the echo of footsteps filled the hallway like distant thunder. I adjusted the brace around my neck, feeling its stiff edges dig into my skin. Dana walked beside me, a steady presence carrying her folders in one hand and a quiet confidence in the other. When we reached courtroom 2B, she paused and touched my arm. "Before we go in, remember this. You do not owe them your silence anymore. You owe yourself the truth." Her words anchored me. I nodded and pushed open the door. The room was already half full. My parents sat at the defense table, their postures stiff and dignified, as if they were attending a ceremony instead of a hearing about their son's violence. My mother wore a pale blue blouse, her hair perfectly styled, her expression carefully curated into soft worry. My father had chosen his best suit, polished shoes, and a tie that matched Mason's. And then there was my brother. Mason sat between them, shoulders squared, jaw tightened, a mask of injured innocence covering his features. He glanced at me when I walked in, his eyes narrowing just enough to reveal the truth behind his polished exterior. Contempt, and beneath it, fear. Dana guided me to the petitioner's table. My hands felt cold as I sat down, but I forced them to remain still. We arranged the documents, placing the MRI at the top, its black and white images waiting for their turn to speak. The judge entered shortly after. Judge Halston was a tall man with graying hair and an expression that suggested he had seen enough human conflict to stop being surprised by any of it. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and surveyed the room with calm authority. "This hearing will address allegations of physical harm brought by Ms. Emily Hart against her brother, Mr. Mason Hart. We will examine evidence, testimony, and medical documentation." He turned to the defense. "Counsel, you may begin." Mason's attorney, a smooth-talking man named Richards, rose from his seat. "Thank you, Your Honor." He straightened his jacket and stepped into the center of the room with the confidence of someone who believed charm could replace truth. "First, let me say that my client is devastated to be here today. He loves his sister deeply and feels great sorrow that she has misconstrued an unfortunate accident into something malicious." Already my mother dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue. My father placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Richards continued. "On the evening in question, Ms. Hart tripped over a rug in her parents' home. In her fall, she inadvertently struck her head and neck. My client attempted to help her, but understandably she was distressed. What followed was a miscommunication fueled by emotion. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mason lower his gaze, adopting the expression of a man burdened by someone else's misinterpretation. The performance would have been convincing to anyone who did not know him. It made my stomach churn. Finally, Richards gestured toward me with a sympathetic tilt of his head. "We believe Ms. Hart's pain is real, but her conclusions are not. This case is the result of severe stress, misremembered events, and outside influence that has encouraged her to view her family in an unfairly negative light." Dana leaned in slightly, her voice low. "Do not let this get into your head. This is strategy, not truth." When Richards returned to his seat, the judge nodded to Dana. "Ms. Whitford, you may proceed." Dana stood her posture straight, her voice steady and crisp. "Thank you, Your Honor." She walked to the center of the room without theatrics' only purpose. This case is not about emotion, it is about evidence. Medical evidence, recorded evidence, and witness testimony that contradicts the defense's version of events. She lifted the MRI report from the table and held it up. We will begin with the objective facts. This imaging study conducted within hours of the incident clearly shows trauma inconsistent with a slip and fall. She handed the document to the bailiff who passed it to the judge. Next, she continued, we will hear from the treating physician who examined Ms. Hart, identified her spinal injury, and documented inconsistencies between her injury and the explanation offered at the time. Dana returned to the table and placed a hand on the folder containing Mrs. Giles's recording. And we will also present audio evidence from a neighbor's security system that captured the moments leading up to the injury. My parents stiffened. Mason's jaw twitched. The judge looked up, eyebrows lifting slightly. Very well. Call your first witness. Dana signaled toward the door. Dr. Patel entered wearing his hospital badge and carrying a small binder of medical notes. His calm presence filled the room with a sense of certainty. He took the oath and settled into the witness chair. Dana approached him. Doctor, can you explain what the MRI revealed? Dr. Patel opened the binder. The injury shows acute swelling and displacement between the C4 and C5 vertebrae. This pattern strongly suggests a direct impact from behind. It is not the type of injury one would sustain from a simple fall. Mason shifted again, his shoulders tightening. My mother pressed her fingers to her lips. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw rigid. Dana continued, her tone steady. Doctor, did Ms. Hart's reported description of events match the injury? No. They were inconsistent. My mother inhaled sharply, a soft, wounded sound as if the truth itself had betrayed her. The judge scribbled notes. Dana stepped back, satisfied. No further questions at this time. Richards stood adjusting his suit jacket. Doctor, is it possible that stress or emotional distress caused my client's sister to misunderstand what happened? Dr. Patel blinked slowly. No. We diagnose injuries with imaging, not feelings. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge's lips twitched, and in that moment I realized something I had never felt before. For the first time in my life, the truth was louder than them. The moment Dr. Patel stepped down from the witness stand, a tension rippled through the courtroom like the shift in air before a storm breaks open. Mason's attorney whispered urgently into his ear, but Mason barely reacted. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, his knuckles white where his hands gripped the edge of the table. My parents sat rigidly beside him, but their expressions were starting to crack at the edges. My mother's eyes darted from the judge to the MRI screen and back again, while my father's posture had grown unnaturally stiff, as if he were bracing for impact. Dana quietly closed her folder and leaned toward me. The defense is panicking, she murmured. Prepare yourself. They will grasp at anything. I nodded, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. The judge turned to Richards. Defense may call its first witness. Richards stood abruptly, almost too quickly, as if trying to regain control. Your Honor, the defense calls Mr. and Mrs. Hart to the stand. My stomach dropped. My parents exchanged a brief look, the kind of silent communication they had perfected over decades. Then my father rose, buttoning his suit jacket with hands that trembled slightly, and walked toward the stand. My mother followed her steps careful, her expression composed but strained. They looked like a united front, a polished image of parental concern. But I knew better. Richards approached them with a rehearsed tone of sympathy. Thank you for coming forward. I know this must be difficult for you. My mother dabbed her eyes. My father nodded solemnly. Then Richards asked the question that would turn the entire courtroom upside down. Can you tell the court what really happened the night of the incident? My father inhaled deeply, his shoulders rising and falling as if he were preparing for a performance. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone revealing a long-buried truth. Emily did not fall because of Mason. She fell because of us. The courtroom went dead silent. Even the air seemed to freeze. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My mother immediately began crying softly into her hands, her shoulders shaking in the dramatic way she reserved for moments she wanted to control. My father continued, his voice cracking with perfectly timed remorse. We argued with her. She stepped back. We reached out to stop her, but she slipped. It was an accident. A terrible, terrible accident. The words struck me like physical blows. A harsh, suffocating pressure filled my chest. They were lying. They were lying under oath, and they were doing it for one reason: to protect Mason. My mother nodded through tears. We never wanted to blame him. He is our son. We are all we have. My father placed an arm around her weakly. She panicked and imagined Mason pushed her, but he did not. We are the ones who caused her to fall. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Even Mason looked startled for a moment, his composure wavering. I stared at my parents, unable to speak, unable to breathe. They were not just choosing him. They were sacrificing themselves to shield him. Dana's hand closed around my wrist, grounding me. "Stay calm," she whispered. "They have just walked into their own trap." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Ms. Whitford, you're cross." Dana rose slowly, almost gracefully, as if savoring the moment. She approached the stand with a calm so steady it unsettled even me. "Mr. Hart," she said, her tone polite, "may I confirm something? The two of you are saying that you physically caused your daughter's injury." My father sat straighter, pride flickering in his eyes at the nobility of his own lie. "Yes, and your wife agrees." My mother nodded shakily. "Yes, I reached for her. She fell back. We are to blame." A small smile touched the corner of Dana's lips. She turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, may I present evidence that directly contradicts this testimony? Permission granted." Dana retrieved the USB drive from her folder and handed it to the bailiff. A moment later, the neighbor's recording filled the courtroom speakers. Mason's yelling echoed through the room. "You are going to sign it whether you like it or not." The thud of my body hitting furniture followed. My strangled gasp. My mother's panicked footsteps delayed, distant. Then silence. Thick, suffocating silence. My mother's face drained of color. My father's jaw dropped. The courtroom erupted with shock. Dana waited until the noise settled, then stepped forward. That, she said quietly, is not the sound of two parents reaching out to steady a falling daughter. She then lifted the MRI. And this is not the injury of someone who tipped backward away from her parents. She turned to Dr. Patel, who had remained in the room. "Doctor, could two older adults accidentally create this injury pattern?" Dr. Patel shook his head without hesitation. "No. This injury requires height angle and force consistent with a direct forward shove delivered by someone younger and stronger." My father slumped back. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Dana continued, her voice crisp as glass. "So, we have medical evidence proving they could not have caused the injury, audio evidence showing they were not present, a witness confirming the statements, and two people on the stand who just perjured themselves to protect their son." Richards tried to speak, but the judge held up a hand. "Enough." He turned to my parents, his expression stern. "Perjury is a serious offense." Their faces collapsed simultaneously. The perfect front they had assembled crumbled. Their attempt to save Mason had only exposed all three of them. And for the first time since the hearing began, I felt something shift. Not victory, not vindication. Something quieter, something deeper. I felt seen, truly seen. Dana placed a hand on my back. "This is the moment everything changes." And she was right. The room, once tilted against me, had finally begun to turn. The judge's gavel had barely settled when Dana requested permission to present the final piece of evidence, the one she said would eliminate any remaining doubt. My pulse quickened as the bailiff dimmed the lights and powered on the projector. The room fell into a hush so deep it felt as if everyone were holding their breath at the same time. Even the hum of the ceiling fans seemed to fade. Mason stiffened beside his attorney, the muscles in his jaw twitching as though he already sensed what was coming. My parents leaned forward with identical looks of dread, their earlier bravado stripped away by the weight of the neighbor's recording. The judge nodded. "Proceed." Dana stepped into the soft blue glow of the screen, holding the MRI film like it was a verdict unto itself. She spoke with unwavering clarity, her voice cutting clean through the tension clouding the courtroom. "What you are about to see is not interpretation. It is not memory. It is not emotional recollection. It is scientific evidence captured within hours of the event. She handed the film to the technician who slid it onto the illuminated panel. Instantly, the cross-sectional image of my neck filled the screen, the swollen tissues glowing stark white against the darker structure of bone. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even those unfamiliar with medical imaging seemed to sense something was terribly wrong in the picture before them. Dr. Patel returned to the witness stand at the judge's request. He adjusted his glasses with steady fingers, then pointed to the enlarged image with the precision of someone accustomed to explaining the unexplainable. "Here," he said, indicating the widened gap and the smudge of brightness spreading along the vertebrae. "This is the inflammatory response from acute trauma. It represents significant tissue swelling." And here he continued, tracing a faint shadow extending diagonally is the point of impact. "The angle confirms force applied from behind and above. This is consistent with someone being pushed." He paused to let the words settle. "It is not under any circumstance consistent with slipping backward on a rug." The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable but intent. Mason shifted in his seat, his breathing shallow. I watched the vein in his neck pulse erratically, watched the way his fingers dug into the armrests like claws. My mother's hand flew to her chest. My father stared at the floor, the muscles around his mouth twitching with a desperate tension. The silence deepened as Dana took another step forward. "Doctor," she asked, "can you confirm the amount of force required for such an injury?" Dr. Patel nodded gravely. The force would need to come from someone younger, stronger, and taller than the patient, someone capable of generating forward momentum. My father's head snapped up at that panic flaring in his eyes. My mother sucked in a sharp breath. Dana pressed on. Could this impact have been caused by either of the two individuals who claimed responsibility earlier? "Absolutely not," Dr. Patel said with quiet finality. "Neither has the physical strength required to produce this type of trauma." The room erupted in whispers, disbelief and anger, swirling like a sudden gust of wind. Mason's attorney rose abruptly. "Your Honor, we strongly object. The doctor is speculating." At the same moment, the technician magnified the image again, displaying the bruising pattern beneath the skin. Dr. Patel continued undeterred. "This is not speculation. This is physiology. Biology does not lie." Judge Halston raised a hand. "Enough. Continue, Doctor." Dr. Patel zoomed in one final time. You can also see here the slight rotational displacement of the cervical vertebrae. This occurs when the head is turned slightly at the moment of impact. The pattern is clear. It matches the mechanism of a forceful shove. Mason's breathing hitched audibly at that. "Wow." For the first time since the hearing began, he looked unmasked, uncertain, cornered. The judge turned toward him. "Mr. Hart, please stand." Mason rose slowly, his legs trembling, his posture faltering. The entire room watched him with electric anticipation. His attorney whispered something sharply, but Mason did not seem to hear. His eyes were locked on the screen, on the glowing image of my injury, on the undeniable truth he could no longer outrun. Judge Halston spoke sternly. "Would you like to revise your previous statements?" Mason opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lips parted again, still nothing. His chest rose and fell rapidly like he was struggling to draw in enough air. The judge repeated, "Mr. Hart, do you wish to change your testimony?" Mason stared at the MRI as if hypnotized. His face went pale, then whiter still, as though all color was draining from him. His fingers twitched, his shoulders slackened, his eyes widened with a haunted, sinking clarity. This was the moment he finally understood. The MRI was not just an image, it was proof. Proof that the truth existed outside of his control. Proof that his lies could not compete with science. Proof that he had hurt me. Proof he could not refute, manipulate, or charm away. The judge waited. Mason's throat worked as though he were trying to swallow something too large to fit. Then, with a suddenness that startled even his attorney, his knees buckled. His body lurched sideways, his hand slipping off the armrest as he collapsed back into the chair. His eyes rolled. Sweat broke across his forehead. His breathing grew shallow and ragged. My mother screamed his name. My father jumped to his feet, knocking over a water glass. The bailiff rushed forward. Paramedics were called from the hallway. The gallery erupted in a flurry of shocked voices. But amid the chaos, something inside me stilled. I watched Mason slump forward, watched his body react to the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindictive. I simply felt the weight I had carried for years begin to lift like a chain sliding quietly off my shoulders. For the first time, he was facing the consequences of his actions, not because I begged, not because I pleaded, but because evidence had spoken louder than all of us. As paramedics tended to him, the judge pounded his gavel. "Order! Order!" The courtroom slowly settled. My parents hovered beside Mason, their earlier arrogance replaced with fear. Fear not of losing him, but fear of losing the version of the story they had tried so hard to maintain. Then the judge looked directly at me. "Ms. Hart, thank you for your patience. This court acknowledges the validity of your evidence, and for the first time in 29 years, an authority figure chose me, not him. Me." My throat tightened, but not from pain. Relief, sharp and overwhelming, washed through me like a tide I had been holding back for far too long. I sat taller in my seat, the brace steadying my neck, but my own strength steadying everything else. The truth had finally taken its rightful place, and the collapse was only the beginning. When the paramedics finally lifted Mason onto the gurney and wheeled him out of the courtroom, the air that remained behind felt charged like the aftermath of lightning striking too close, and every person in the room seemed to hold a different kind of breath, some fearful, some stunned, some quietly vindicated. The judge called a brief recess to allow the chaos to settle, but when the court reconvened 30 minutes later, the gallery had filled even more word, evidently spreading through the courthouse about the dramatic collapse of the defendant. And yet, despite the spectacle, the weight of what was coming next felt heavier than anything that had happened so far, because spectacle fades, but sentencing stays. As I sat at the petitioner's table, the neck brace stiff against my jaw, I could feel Dana's presence beside me like an anchor, steady and unwavering, while across the aisle, my parents sat alone now. Mason's attorney whispering urgently to them, even though their faces looked hollowed out, drained of the confidence they carried just hours before, and when the bailiff called the court to order every shuffle and breath in the room stilled. Judge Halston returned to the bench with a measured calm that somehow made the next moments feel even more decisive. His gaze sweeping the room before settling squarely on my parents, then on the empty chair where Mason had been sitting, and finally on me. After reviewing the evidence, he began, "This court finds that the explanation provided by the defense is inconsistent with the medical findings, the audio recording, and the witness testimony." His voice remained steady, controlled, but beneath it was a firmness that felt immovable, the kind of certainty that comes only when truth is undeniable. He continued, "The MRI findings demonstrate acute trauma resulting from a forceful shove, not a slip, and the neighbor's recording establishes the defendant's aggression prior to the injury." I felt my heartbeat thud painfully against the brace, each word landing like a slow, steady drumbeat in my chest. The judge shifted his attention toward Mason's empty chair, as though he were speaking directly to him. "Therefore, this court rules that Mr. Mason Hart is responsible for causing physical harm to the petitioner, Ms. Emily Hart." Quietly, almost imperceptibly, I exhaled. The judge straightened a stack of papers. "In addition to the criminal charge of assault resulting in bodily injury, Marisa, Hart will be mandated to undergo anger management counseling, a psychiatric evaluation, and supervised probation." The murmurs behind me rose, disbelief and vindication blending into one low hum. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes glistening with a mixture of shock and something that looked a little like dread, and my father's posture sagged as though the sentence had knocked the wind from him. The judge, however, was not finished. "Furthermore, in light of the parents' attempt to mislead the court, this case will be referred to the district attorney's office for review regarding potential charges of obstruction and perjury." The gasp that tore through the courtroom shook even me, because although I had known the truth would reach them eventually, hearing it spoken aloud by a judge carried a finality that surpassed anything I had imagined. My mother whispered something to my father, her face drained of all color, while my father's eyes darted around the room as though searching for an escape route that did not exist. Dana remained perfectly still, her chin slightly lifted, her expression soft but unmistakably victorious. The judge's voice softened when he turned back toward me. Ms. Hart, this court acknowledges the pain you have endured and the courage it took to seek justice. You are hereby granted full compensation for medical expenses, lost wages, and damages related to emotional distress. The words pressed into me like a warm weight, grounding and overwhelming all at once. I swallowed hard emotion, tightening my throat in a way I had not expected, because this was more than compensation, more than a ruling, more than legal language strung together. It was recognition, finally, after a lifetime of being dismissed and minimized and overshadowed. It was someone in authority saying, "You matter, your pain matters, your truth matters." As the judge concluded, the court will also grant a long-term protective order against Mr. Hart effective immediately. The hammer of his gavel cracked sharply through the room, a clean, decisive sound that seemed to cut the air in two, and with that, the hearing ended. People began to rise from their seats, the hush breaking into scattered conversations. But I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the ruling settle into my bones. My parents stood slowly, their movements dazed, fragile, stripped of their practiced poise, and for the first time in my life, they looked small to me. Not because the world had shrunk them, but because the truth had finally revealed their real size. Dana touched my shoulder gently. "Ready when you are," she said, and I nodded, rising on steady legs. As we walked toward the exit, the courtroom buzzing behind us, I felt something unfamiliar bloom quietly inside my chest, a soft, warm clarity. Justice had spoken, and for once it had spoken in my direction. In the days that followed the verdict, the consequences moved through our lives like a slow, spreading ripple across still water, quiet at first, but increasingly undeniable, reshaping everything it touched. And although I had prepared myself for the aftermath, nothing could have fully braced me for the way each piece of fallout revealed a truth I had ignored for years. The first shift came with a phone call from the hospital's HR department informing me that Mason had been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, which was the sanitized version of saying that after the courtroom collapse, after the evidence, and after the judge's ruling, no institution wanted to be associated with the man whose aggression had now become public record. And as that news circulated, his friends began distancing themselves, the group that once rallied around him shrinking until only silence remained. Next came the impact on my parents, who faced the consequences they had tried to outrun their attempted obstruction, now under review by the district attorney's office, leaving them in a state of constant dread, a dread that clung to them like a second skin. I heard through a distant relative that their social circle, once filled with church acquaintances and old neighborhood friends, had grown noticeably thinner, people avoiding them with polite excuses that barely concealed their discomfort. And slowly, steadily, my parents found themselves isolated in a way they had never experienced before. No longer the admired couple with the successful son and the dependable daughter, but the pair who lied in court to protect the child who had caused harm. Yet even those consequences paled compared to what unfolded financially. Mason's legal fees mounted, quickly draining his savings, and with his job suspended, he had no income to support the lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. My parents, who had always rushed to rescue him, now faced their own financial strain, the cost of attorneys, and the looming possibility of fines from the perjury investigation, forcing them to sell off what little remained of the assets they once guarded so fiercely. The house I had grown up in, the symbol of everything they cherished, was listed quietly on the market within 2 months. I learned all of this in passing, not because they told me, but because people talk. And when a family's downfall is this public, the story spreads with a life of its own. Yet what struck me most was not the financial collapse or the social fallout, but the way their choices finally caught up to them in places far removed from courtrooms and documents. One morning, while heading to a physical therapy session, I stepped into the waiting area of a Medicaid office to check in for insurance verification, and there they were. My parents sitting side by side in the hard plastic chairs, their shoulders slumped, their hands clasped tightly like two people waiting on a lifeline they never imagined they would need. They did not notice me. I stood for a moment watching them from several feet away, and in that quiet space, I understood something I had never seen clearly before. Their power had always been borrowed, propped up by the image they projected, and the illusion they maintained, and now that illusion had shattered, leaving them exposed, vulnerable, small. I did not speak to them. I did not rush to comfort or confront. I simply turned and walked toward my appointment, my footsteps steady, my heart strangely calm. I was not avoiding them out of anger, nor was I distancing myself out of spite. I was simply acknowledging the truth that for the first time their lives no longer intersected with mine out of obligation or expectation. Meanwhile, my own life began to rebuild itself in ways I had not anticipated. Physical therapy helped ease the stiffness in my neck, each session a reminder that healing like justice is slow but steady. My colleagues at the hospital treated me with a quiet respect that had never existed before, as if the act of standing up for myself had rewritten the way they saw me. I found myself breathing easier, walking lighter, no longer shrinking out of habit. And gradually, I started receiving emails from women in the community, some from the hospital and some from complete strangers, each one sharing their own stories of family denial, of hidden injuries, of being silenced. Their words created an invisible bridge between us, a reminder that my experience was not isolated, but part of a larger painful pattern that too many endured alone. One afternoon, as I sat with Dana at a small cafe near the river, she said something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. "You did not just win a case, Emily. You reclaimed your life." And in that moment, watching the sunlight dance off the surface of the water, I realized she was right. Everything I had lost had been replaced with something far more precious: space clarity and a life that finally belonged to me. And the most unexpected part of all was the peace that settled in my chest. A peace I had never known in my parents' house. A peace that tasted like fresh air after years of breathing in smoke. The consequences had unfolded, and for the first time they were not mine to carry. In the months that followed, a quiet stillness settled into my life, not the brittle silence I had grown up with, but a warm, breathable peace that seeped into every corner of my days as I slowly rebuilt myself in ways I had never imagined possible. Beginning with my move to Greenville, where I rented a small cottage tucked beneath tall oak trees whose branches formed a canopy that filtered the morning light into soft, golden streams, and each sunrise felt like a quiet promise that my life no longer belonged to pain or expectation, but to myself. I spent the first few weeks arranging my new home with deliberate simplicity, choosing gentle colors, open space, and soft textures that made the air feel light, and for the first time I allowed myself to rest, truly rest, without the fear of being interrupted or judged. The neck pain eased as physical therapy continued, and each session felt like peeling away one more layer of the past, until my body stopped bracing automatically for a blow that no longer existed in my world. Slowly, my days found rhythm, and as the seasons shifted toward early fall, I began volunteering with a local support group for women recovering from domestic and family-based violence, not out of obligation or a desire to relive my own story, but because I understood the silence these women carried, the shame that was not theirs to hold, the ache that lingered long after the world forgot what had happened to them, and in helping them find their voices again, I found my own growing stronger. Eventually, the group suggested I take on a larger role, and within a few months, I helped open a small community resource space where women could receive counseling, medical referrals, and support navigating legal protections. A place where the truth was not questioned, minimized, or twisted, but honored. It was there, in that quiet room with its soft chairs and shelves lined with comforting books, that I realized my life had expanded into something I had never dared to dream. A life defined not by the harm done to me, but by the strength I had cultivated in surviving it. As for my parents and Mason, their paths drifted far from mine, not with the sharpness of anger, but with the inevitability of a tide receding from shore. And though I occasionally heard updates through distant relatives, the information stirred nothing in me except a gentle acknowledgement that some stories unravel not with fireworks or vengeance, but with silence that no longer carries grief. One crisp morning in October, as I sat on my porch with a mug of warm tea cradled in my hands and watched leaves fall in slow spirals to the ground, I felt a deep, grounding truth settle quietly inside me. I no longer needed closure from the people who had fractured me. I had found closure in choosing myself, and in the soft rustle of the trees, I heard the echo of something Dana once told me. Something that now felt like the final sentence to the story I had lived through. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is a silent truth that finally refuses to carry anyone else's lies. And sitting there under the golden morning light, I understood fully, perhaps for the first time, that the peace I held in my hands now was not a gift someone gave me, but the result of stepping out of a lifetime of shadows and into a life that was finally mine. Unburdened, unbroken, unbound. If you are still here with me after everything Emily went through, I want you to take a breath for a moment and really feel what your heart is doing right now, because stories like this do not just sit quietly in the mind, they stir something deeper. Something many of us have carried for years without naming the weight of being dismissed, the ache of being overlooked, the memory of being the one who held a family together while others broke it apart. And if any part of Emily's journey touched your chest in a way that felt uncomfortably familiar, I hope you know you are not alone in that feeling. I hope you know that somewhere across this vast country, someone else is watching this video right now with the same trembling recognition, the same sharp sting of "that happened to me too," the same mix of relief and sorrow at seeing your own story reflected in someone else's fight for justice. And if this story made you angry, if it made you want to stand up and shout that enough is enough, I want you to let that anger breathe, because sometimes outrage is simply grief that has finally grown tired of whispering. So I want to ask you from a place of compassion and truth, have you ever been the one in your family who carried everyone else? Have you ever been the one they blamed because it was easier than facing the real problem? Have you ever walked through life wondering how different things might have been if just one person had stood up for you the way Emily finally stood up for herself? If even one of those questions touches a tender place in your memory, I invite you to share a piece of your story in the comments, not for me, but for yourself, and for the thousands of people reading who need to know they are not the only ones who lived through something that should never have happened. You never know who you might be helping just by speaking your truth out loud for the first time. And if you do not feel ready to share, that is perfectly okay too, because healing does not follow a schedule, and sometimes simply watching a story like this is the first brave step toward reclaiming your voice. But if you felt your chest tighten when the MRI was shown, or your breath hitch when Emily heard her parents laughing behind her back, or your heart crack just a little when she walked past them in the Medicaid office without looking back, then stay with us here on this channel, because this space is for people like you. People who survived more than they ever told people who learned to stay quiet for too long. People who deserve a soft landing and a strong voice. Every story we share is crafted to speak to the soul, to honor those who lived through injustice, and to remind you that choosing yourself is not selfish, it is survival. So if today's story stayed with you, if it stirred something or gave you a moment of clarity, I would love for you to subscribe and join this growing community of people who are finally learning to name the things they buried and breathe again after years of holding it all in. And before this video ends, I want to leave you with a question that might feel simple, but has the power to open a door inside you. When was the moment you realized you deserved better than the way you were treated? If that moment came years ago, or if it is only coming to you now, your voice matters, and I hope you share it below, because your truth might be exactly what someone else needs to read tonight. Thank you for being here. Thank you for feeling this story with me, and thank you for choosing to stay until the very end. It means more than you know.